Hello everyone and welcome back to this, welcome to another Gcse history video. Obviously the exam board's Eduqas, and today we're going to be covering the Lincoln Castle, Jail and Prison from 1787 to 1878. If I sound like I'm whispering, it's because I am. It's very late. Time is currently 23 minutes past midnight, and yeah, so just turn your volume up. Okay, let's get into the video. So the incarceration of criminals for long periods of time was unusual before the 18th century, so the 1700s. Medieval castles had dungeons where rebels or hostages could be kept, but criminals tended to be dealt with in other ways. The idea of imprisoning criminals with a view to reforming them had begun with the development of houses of correction and bridewells in the 16th century to help reform criminals through hard work. However, these facilities were small and only existed in a few places. Most jails by the 18th century were just places to temporarily hold criminals, waiting for their punishment, or people who had not yet had their trial. There were also people who were debtors rather than criminals, so they were in debt and they hadn't paid their debts, who were imprisoned as a consequence of owing money. Some debtors could buy themselves better conditions than other prisoners, but in some places they had to mix in the same cells as violent criminals. By the middle of the 18th century, there were about 4,000 people imprisoned in Britain. This was quite a low number, as most criminals in this time were transported to the colonies in America. Three changes put huge pressures on the old system of bridewells and jails. The war with the American colonies, most crimes were under the bloody code. However, most judges preferred not to sentence them to death, thus leaving them in jails rather than sending them for execution. And population growth combined with increasing urbanization was increasing the number of criminals. There were no rules about how prisons should be run. Local responsibility could sometimes be unclear, and existing buildings were not fit for purpose and lacked proper sanitation. Some were no more than a single room that all prisoners, male, female, young, old, were all kept in, becoming increasingly overcrowded. As a result, diseases like typhus ran riot amongst prisoners. It had been estimated that these late 18th century jails, 25% of prisoners died each year. John Howard had taken an interest in prisons, so he is one of the prison reformers that you need to know. John Howard had taken an interest in prisons when he had been appointed High Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1773. What he saw in prisons horrified him, leading to the publication of his book, The State of Prisons since 1777. The book details what he found in each prison that he visited in England and Wales, including the jail in Lincoln Castle. Howard highlighted a number of problems that he believed needed to be dealt with urgently: the levels of illness and death amongst prisoners, the corruption of those left in charge of prisoners, the lack of separation of prisoners by gender or severity of offence, the general lack of security in prisons, and he believed that prisoners could be turned away from a life of crime if they had the proper conditions to learn the errors of their ways. He wanted all prisons to have medical treatment available, better food and sanitation, as well as paid jailers, and that religious teachers could have access to prisoners. Sir George Wansiferus Poole created a prison design that addressed many of Howard's concerns. It separated male and female prisoners, as well as providing workshops and chapels. He also argued that improved ventilation and regular exercise were important to prevent the spread of diseases like typhus. As I mentioned earlier, Jeremy Bentham also had designed the Panopticon prison in the 1790s, which organized prisoners into single cells around a central area to allow the prison guards to observe them more easily. The design became very influential after the after the 1820s. Another influential prisoner reform campaigner was Elizabeth Fry. She was outraged at the conditions for female prisoners in Newgate prison, particularly that convicted criminals and those waiting for their trials were kept together and were forced to sleep on the floor. She set up a chapel and school at the prison, as well as providing bedding for the prisoners. Fry's evidence to Parliament was very influential in the 1823 Jails Act, which was passed to try and improve conditions in prisons. This criminal system had suffered a huge shock in 1776 when transportation to the American colonies was ended by the War of Independence. While a new location for transportation was being found, convicts awaiting transportation were kept in old ships, anchored in rivers that were called prison hulks. Conditions on these hulks were just as bad as the jails that had been criticised by John Howard. So this is the prison hulk here. Lincoln Castle was an ideal place to keep prisoners due to the nature of a castle with its high walls and gates. By the 18th century, there were two places in Lincoln Castle that held prisoners: the county jail, referred to as some as the Old Jail, and Cobb Hall, a tower in the castle walls. A mixture of debtors, people awaiting trial, and convicted criminals were kept there. The Old Jail was situated in the middle of the castle's bailey. In the Georgian prison, debtors were treated much more leniently than criminals. They had the rooms at the front of the building looking onto the castle grounds, while the criminals were housed in a much simpler building, now demolished, that was called the Felons' Wing at the back of the exercise yards. The prisoner governor lived in an apartment at the top, along with his family. At this point, jailers were still allowed to financially exploit their position as they were not paid, were able to use their prisoners as free labourers, charging prisoners for bedding and food, to have their shackles removed, and even sell ale to prisoners. As part of a new prison building program followed by the 1839 Prisons Act, 1848 Lincoln's Felons' Wing was demolished to be replaced by the Crown Wing, based on a design by William Adams Nicholson, which people today refer to as the Victorian prison. This is where male, female, and child prisoners were held before their trials. Criminals waiting to be executed or transferred to other prisons were held here. The prison was now a H-shaped building with an enclosed exercise yards in between its wings. The Victorian prison was designed to be a separate system prison, which was introduced into Lincolnshire by Joshua Jepp, who had built the model prison at Pentonville. Prisoners were to be kept separate from each other at all times so that they could contemplate the errors of their lives alone and in silence. The only person that the prisoners were allowed to speak to was the prison chaplain. There were separate exercise yards where the prisoners had to exercise alone. There were issues with the new prison building. The sewers got blocked very quickly, and the hot air blowing through the prison may have been responsible for a typhoid outbreak in 1851. One of the most prominent features of the Victorian prison is its chapel. As prisoners were not allowed to communicate with each other, they each had their own stall. During services, the only person they could see would be the chaplain. So this is what that would look like, and this is kind of what their cell would look like. Lincoln Castle was also the site of executions. Executions at Lincoln had originally taken place outside the castle walls on Burton Road. The prisoner would have been brought to the gallows standing on the back of a car. Once the noose had been placed around their neck, they would then hang until they were dead. For a fee to the hangman, members of the family would be allowed to pull on the victim's legs so that they died quicker. It's quite gruesome. Executions also had a big audience, sometimes as many as 15,000 people. Local hotels selling out, and some selling very expensive rooms that had direct view of the execution. Lincoln Castle was the site of a first new kind of hanging. William Marwood had developed a method in which using someone's height and weight to work out how long the rope should be and result in the most effective hanging. With the right amount of slack and the right placing of the knot in the noose, the neck would be broken quickly, but without the risk of decapitation. This method became known as the measured drop or the long drop. Public hangings were banned by the 1868 Capital Punishment Amendment Act. After that, hangings took place in a side couple with just journalists present. Priscilla Biggerdyke, who had poisoned her husband with arsenic, but whose lodger admitted to the crime a year after her execution, was the first to be executed this way. In 1872, a new prison was built, H&P Lincoln, on Greetwell Road, at the outer edge of Lincoln by Frederick Peck, in the High Victorian Gothic style, with prison numbers decreasing as more and more were transferred to the new prison, along with the ongoing expense of maintaining facilities in a medieval castle. Lincoln's Victorian prison finally closed in 1878. To begin with, H&P Lincoln had both male and female prisoners, but was reduced to only male prisoners in 1900. 18 executions took place here between 1883 and 1961. After a serious prisoner riot in 2002, the prison was named as one of Britain's most overcrowded prisons. By 2020, however, it was operating at slightly below its maximum capacity. Medieval prisoners were aristocratic rebels, and their followers or prisoners of war, turned into the Lincoln Castle County Jail in the Tudor period. By the 17th century, it was in regular use for keeping prisoners, which continued into the 18th century. Lincoln Prison's adverts for turnkeys, which were prison guards, offered decent salaries for applicants who could teach the inmates the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Those who still refused to behave in a civilized way could still be treated more severely, and the most serious crimes were still punishable by death. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. That is horrifying. That's actually ruined my day, and the day's just begun. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and good luck in your exams. Thank you, bye!